Allow me to introduce the Executive Manager for Business Development and Commercialization in the Natural Resources, Enabling Infrastructure, Public and Professional Services Division, and the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, which is CSIR. And he goes by the name of Mr. Kolisa Magwantla. Over to you, sir, and welcome.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction, and welcome to everybody to this panel discussion, which will run for just over an hour. And it's a very interesting topic, that we will be debating on. And we've got an excellent panel of people with industry experience, global recognition in the work that they do, and in a lot of instances, also thought leaders in their own right when it comes to sustainability, as well as the topics of environment, social, and governance. The first panelist that we have is Ms. Joanne Yawich, and Joanne has been the Chief Executive Officer of the National Business Initiative since March 2011, and having been previously the Deputy Director General for Climate Change at the then Department of Environmental Affairs, with responsibility for environmental quality and protection, as well as for the department's climate change work. Prior to that, Joanne worked for the Gauteng Department of Environment between 1997 and 2004, and before that was special advisor to the then Minister of Land Affairs. Currently, she is the chairperson of the Board of Directors for South African National Parks and is a board member of SAFCOL, as well as the chair of their Social and Ethics Committee. So you will agree with me that Joanne is well positioned to share some insights with us on the topic. Secondly, we are joined by Feroz Kaur, who is Group Head of Sustainability for Woolworths Holding Limited and responsible for the delivery of the overall sustainability strategy and performance of the group across its businesses in Africa and Australasia. So there's some international perspectives that we might get in this regard as well. Feroz has led the development of Woolworths' sustainability strategy, known as Vision 2025 Plus, and is working to support the business in achieving its vision of being one of the most responsible retailers in the world. He has extensive track record of working in the field of sustainability and has headed up sustainability department at 3 JSE top 40 companies over the past decade. Feroz is an admitted attendee. The third panelist to introduce is Sanjeev Raghuvir. Sanjeev's job is to establish a sustainability strategy and implementation plan for the biggest retailer in Africa, the Shoprite Group, to minimize its environmental footprint across its value chain. And this is quite an important perspective that we have in terms of this discussion, looking at the full value chain on how we look at sustainability. Sanjeev studied at the CSIR, where he worked as an environmental engineer. And in 2003, he moved to Nestle, South Africa, as Corporate Safety, Health, and Environmental Sustainability Manager, looking after this portfolio in the Southern and Eastern African region. So there are some continental perspectives that we'll get here. He holds a degree in chemical engineering, an honors degree in environmental engineering, and an MBA. And he's passionate about all aspects of environmental, social sustainability, including creating awareness about key issues and loves recycling. The next panelist to introduce is Chantel, who is a director at PwC's Sustainability and Climate Change team. Chantel holds a Master's of Science degree, specializing in environmental science, and has over 16 years of experience working with the private sector, public and private sector. Chantal has focused on strategic sustainability initiatives and gained experience in project design, leadership, and management. She has also been involved with the detailed implementation of the Sustainability and Climate Advisory and Assurance Programs for the private sector. So we get public and private sector perspectives in this instance. And Chantal has been involved with researching how integrated performance management within businesses can effectively support the resilience of the systems within which they exist. Her interests also lie in embedding sustainable development goals and the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, within an organization as means of ensuring their long-term viability and to maximize their contribution to the economy and society. So we're in good hands here. And we also have Ron Sneyman, who has been working as a sustainability manager in Pick and Pay for the past 6 years. His primary responsibilities are centered on environmental management and reporting, in addition to the implementation of sustainability projects and CSII initiatives. Rowan's main focus areas include climate change, which I'm very passionate about as well, sustainable seafood, food waste, packaging, water, palm oil, deforestation, ESG reporting, as well as community projects and initiatives. And I trust that we will be getting some good insights across the entire value chain in the FMCG sector. Rowan has worked as an ESG research analyst at the Center for Corporate Governance in Africa for 2.5 years before joining Pick and Pay. Within that portfolio, he worked on a wide range of different projects in the anti-corruption, environmental, social, and governance field. So those are the external panelists, for lack of a better word, because by design, we wanted to ensure that as the CSIR, we also ensure that we get the private sector voice, which is strongly aligned to the organization's strategy going forward. However, we've got some experts from within the CSIR, globally and nationally recognized, starting with Dr. Lauren Haywood, who is a senior researcher in sustainability economics and waste research group within the CSIR. She holds a PhD in zoology and environmental science from the University of the Witwatersrand. Lauren has specialist knowledge and experience in strategic environmental management, sustainability assessment and reporting, risk management, corporate sustainability, sustainable development goals, and the development of tools that enable business to transform their current sustainability practice towards embracing systems resilience and contribute towards SDGs. She is responsible for the establishment of a research agenda in corporate sustainability within the CSIR and guidelines which introduce systems and resilience thinking into ISO 31000 risk management process and into business strategy management and reporting. And last but not least is Professor Linda Godfrey, who is a principal scientist at the CSIR and an extraordinary professor at the Northwest University. She holds a PhD in engineering with over 20 years of sector experience. She manages the Waste Research Development and Innovation Roadmap Implementation Unit on behalf of the government. She has provided strategic input into several local, regional, and international waste and circular economy initiatives for the United Nations, the European Union, World Bank, the South African government, Academy of Science, International Solid Waste Association, universities, and businesses. She lectures internationally on solid waste management in developing countries, including the social, economic, and environmental opportunities of waste within a circular economic context. And she has published extensively in that field. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, the way in which we intend running this specific panel discussion is that each of the external panelists will make some reflections on a specific question that we'd like to put to them, which is what are the opportunities and constraints in navigating unprecedented global change challenges, including that of climate change, biodiversity loss, pandemics, cybersecurity threats, and decreasing resources in terms of value chains, a changing regulatory environment, and a changing investment decision-making and annual reporting regime. I think one of the most interesting things previously, just to suggest that how topical this is, I think a day or two, the president of China, Xi Jinping, indicated that China is not going to be financing any coal-fired power generation in the world. And there are several other pledges, including from the private sector, in terms of asset management companies, on where the world is going in respect of sustainability. And we all know that practice follow where the money is. So if we see money going into sustainable and ESG directed interventions, then we should know that it's time for a change, and we should find ways of how we respond to that. So first up, I'm gonna call on Joanne to just share her broad reflections on this, understanding that after the four panelists have made their comments, we will try and dig deeper with the help of Lauren and so Joanne, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. It's a really interesting topic. And where I want to start, I'll come onto your question, but I think that when we talk about ESG, what for me lies at the bottom of it, and at the bottom of this kind of increasingly strong emphasis on ESG in the corporate sector internationally is an understanding of accountability that is very different to the traditional corporate understanding of accountability to owners and shareholders and investors. And so I think that if you operate within an ESG paradigm, what it means is that the levels of accountability and the scope of accountability widens. It's an accountability to society, it's an accountability to stakeholders, it's an accountability to communities, it's an accountability to your own workers, and to recognize, I think, the issues that different groupings within the workplace have. And then it's also a much broader accountability to society and planet. So I think that we need to understand that, for me, as the basis of looking at issues around opportunities and constraints. So I think that's the first point to make. I think the second thing that is critical in this ESG framework is that whether something is an opportunity or a constraint, I think is really very much about the mindset with which you come to it on the one hand, and the degree of innovation which companies are prepared to embrace in firstly defining the opportunities, but then also in addressing the constraints. And so really it is what you make of it. And I think that what we've seen internationally and around the world, including in our own country over the last 10, maybe longer years, 10, 15 years, is that the companies who embrace change, who are innovative, who can appropriately locate themselves within a broader set of societal imperatives, are the companies who tend to thrive and the companies who tend to flourish. And I think that that is what the ESG opportunity is. Having said that, I think that the opportunities in a company embedding an ESG approach to their core business, that really requires a mindset shifts across the board and a lot of internal work in order to build consensus, in order to define where you're going, in order to be able to understand priorities, in order to understand how those priorities talk to both the needs of the company and the growth of the company, as well as talking to a broader set of issues in society. And I think particularly in the context of something like climate change in our own environment, that the opportunities are huge for South African companies. The World Business Council on Sustainable Development, and my organization is the regional partner for that, has done a lot of work over the last number of years to ask the question of what would we need for us to be living on a planet in 2050 where 9 billion people have an adequate and good quality of life, and what does business need to do in order to achieve that? And I really think that that question opens the way for companies to see new growth paths, new strategies, new ways of interacting with customers and suppliers in such a way that we are looking towards the development of the products and the services that we're going to need to actually have in place for a sustainable future. So I think I'll stop there and come in again later, Lisa.
Okay, thanks, Joanne, for those insights. Definitely something to chew on, and we do intend in the last half of this panel discussion to start digging deeper on some of these aspects. So next up for initial reflections, I'll call on you, Feroz, to just share your initial thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Kolisa, and good afternoon to fellow panelists and to everybody else listening in. I mean, look, it's a fantastic question. There's just so many ways to potentially approach it. I think the starting point would be what do we define as ESG, and is it something that is looked at separately to how we run to the rest of the business? Do we look at here is our business, we run our business, and then here's this ESG obligations or requirements that we have, or do we see it as a holistic view and approach to how we manage our company? And what is it that we are focusing on? And what do we take into account in running the day-to-day operations of the organizations that we are involved in? And for me, that talks to the approach you take to it and how embedded it is in your operations, and therefore the kind of approach you take in essentially managing on a day-to-day basis with a view to the bigger picture. And that's what it's about. It's about understanding where do you locate yourself in the broader context. Essentially, I think the way I would look at it simply is, as an organization, we impact society and the environment, and it impacts us. Are we mindful of all of this? Are we aware of it? And what are we doing to manage it, both proactively and reactively? And it's once we have that broader contextual understanding, we then are able to understand what needs to be done in order to be either responding or being proactive in the space. So if we, and what I mean by that is organizations tend to be very specialized or really, really skilled in their core competencies. You know, if you're a retailer or a miner or bank, you're really, really skilled in that. And the question is, how wide is your view in that space? And are you taking into account the bigger picture and therefore understanding the changing landscape? So, you know, you might be able to produce widget A phenomenally well, but are you taking a long-term view and understanding what climate change is all about, what impact your operations has on environment, and how potentially climate change might impact your supply chain, for example? What is the role of what is happening in your supply chain? Depending on what kind of products you source or manufacture, what are the risks that are attendant to that? And conversely, the opportunities for either making changes in your supply chain, in your operations, in your product, how you sell your product, how you approach market. For me, it's essentially that. It's what are you looking at? What do you take into account in your decision making? And how far do you believe your span of control goes? And how far beyond that are you willing to engage in a collaborative manner with a broader range of stakeholders? And those stakeholders everybody in society, government, NGOs, public sector, communities, and noting that it's a fluid and dynamic space, and that one's role in that is not purely defined to, well, I am company A, this is what I do, and I don't care what happens outside the four walls of my organization. And so that's essentially, for me, the approach that needs to be taken in understanding what do we define by ESG, and therefore everything that would fall within environment or social or governance in relation to how we relate to society and how society relates to us is within our purview that we need to be mindful of. And then, that comes down to how you manage it, how you report against it, what indices you look at to be rated on, what reporting frameworks you use, how you go out and relate to your stakeholders around these things, how you build all of this into your business, into your product line, how do you make it a differentiator of your organization, of your product. And within that, you realize that the scope is as broad as you want to make it to be, or as narrow as you want to make it to be, and can either be a hindrance because you might see it as something, well, there's another compliance thing I need to do, or here's something that's just making my life more difficult. Or you can look at it as an opportunity. I mean, and opportunities are not there just to say, well, I'm going to sell a different product, but well, that might be one of the opportunities, but the opportunity might be, well, I produce it differently, or I engage with my supplier differently, or I am able to engage with my customer differently. And that's where the challenge comes in, is to understand that am I being forced to do something? Am I doing something that I don't want to do? Or is it really something I should be doing in order to effectively run my organization? And have I got the correct context in order to understand it that way?
Okay,
I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot for that, Feroz. And I think we will dig a little bit deeper on some of the points that you raised, particularly that a lot of the value chains of business, it doesn't matter which sector you are in, they are global in nature. There's shifting geopolitical dynamics, across the world. Different parts of the world are affected differently by climate change. You also have different regulatory environments. So we certainly are going to come back and seek your inputs and solicit your counsel in terms of what you think. How far should business be defining some of these things? So having said that, I'm gonna request the next panelist, which is Rowan Sneeman, to just share his initial reflections as well. Rowan, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to participate. Yes, this is certainly a very, very topical issue. From a Pick n Pay perspective, I feel that we have never received as many requests around ESG, especially from investors, as we have over the past year. So it's certainly a very important topic, and I think it's under development both internationally and locally as well. And I think it's very important because sustainability and CSI, those topics have been around for a very long time, but companies have often treated that as a brand value or from a marketing perspective to see how can they use sustainability to get more customers or to connect to customers. And although that's not wrong, I think sustainability should be much more strategic than that, and it should be much more central to how a company can operate. And I feel that that's the developments that we're seeing around ESG globally now, that speaks to drive companies to take more accountability of how they work on the ESG areas, and how they implement projects, how they launch targets, and how they track themselves against them. It's all about driving that accountability, where companies don't just talk about sustainability, but actually implement programs to shift the way they operate. And then just to agree what Feroz said, it's a very broad landscape and it's very complex. ESG essentially covers almost any area that a company can have an impact on. That includes the value chains that they operate through, but also the customers they interact with. So it's not a simple or easy thing. the data is usually very complex. When you talk about ESG, it's usually associated with things like food waste or packaging or palm oil or sustainable seafood. And all those areas, as examples, have very complex data to work with. And that's one of the difficult things for companies is getting the data right before they do the reporting. Getting the data right, setting their targets, reporting against their targets, and launching their programs, it's a very time-consuming and long process. It's not something that happens in a couple of months. So usually, in my perspective, there's a massive emphasis on ESG reporting at the moment, but the focus should rather be, for companies at least, to launch those programs and to shift strategically toward ESG, even if they're not yet in the position to report their progress from an ESG perspective. Just talking from experience, ESG reporting is a massive time constraint in companies, and it's not easy because many different organizations and institutions track the same metrics in different ways. So now as a company, you have to understand all those different methodologies. You have to complete a lot of different surveys and questionnaires, many of which look to answer the same questions, but ask them in a different way, which makes it immensely difficult internally to respond to those questions effectively, because it's not always aligned to how you track those specific areas internally. And for me, that means that sometimes, in some cases, sustainability teams can become reporting teams. And that's essentially, you don't really want that as a company. Because if the objective is only reporting, then sometimes, and I'm not saying it's always the case, sometimes those teams don't engage with the other internal departments at a strategic level as much as they should, because they're so preoccupied just doing the reporting, just ticking those boxes, rather than trying to implement strategic projects that can potentially shift the way the company operates. So that's just my opinion, in that there should be the correct balance between focusing on ESG, but as a strategic value for the company, and then the reporting that follows should reflect how the company operates in those areas, rather than the other way around. Reporting shouldn't drive the company's strategic value. But both these areas are very important in my view. But yes, as a sustainability manager, I'm very excited about the developments that are happening globally. From an ESG perspective, that means that there's a potential for us internally to launch a lot more projects and to do a lot more positive work. None of this is easy or simple, but I think it's a very good journey to be on. And that's my view from Pick n Pay.
Okay. No, thanks a lot, Rowan. I'm sure my colleagues from the CSIR are getting quite excited, because as soon as you mention complexity and data, then they start thinking, okay, what is it that we can do with that? And I think we're going to traverse again some of the critical points that I think Joanne raised it as well at the start. It's integration into business strategy rather than reporting compliance. I think a lot of the complexity actually lies in that, on how you define the scope and what sort of metrics do you track, which are material to your business, and the reporting becomes more of a hygiene issue, but the imperative is that of the business. And thanks for your comments there. And now let's move on to Sanjeev. Sanjeev, you've got some time to just share your initial reflections here. Thank you.
Thanks, Kolisa. I think, yeah, it's an interesting discussion as well. And as odd as it may sound, recently we haven't been short of, as you described it, unprecedented global changes and challenges, be it the pandemic, be it climate change, cybersecurity, etc. And I think that the one thing that comes up is around the ability of organizations to be more agile, to be able to navigate within this type of environment. But I want to focus and draw more attention towards the issues of climate change, and particularly because the recent IPCC report gave us a lot of food for thought. And particularly if you look at the regional fact sheets for southern, western, and eastern Africa. We're seeing a lot of predictions around changes in precipitation, so lower precipitation, and as we're seeing in the Eastern Cape right now, as well as in some cases much higher incidence of precipitation and level 4 and 5 cyclones, as we've seen recently with Cyclone Eloise that came through Mozambique and parts of Mpumalanga. But what we're also seeing is that it impacts significantly on the food systems. So you may recall earlier in the year, there was a shortage of tomatoes on the market, which led to an increases in prices. And that was particularly because, or primarily because the Cyclone Eloise had such a devastating impact in Mpumalanga. And whilst the IPCC report is projecting and predicting this in the next 50 or at the turn of the century, we're already seeing these issues and these impacts happening now. So, as you suggested, it presents a lot of challenge, yet opportunities for businesses and for organizations. I think on the challenge side, it's being able to navigate in these areas, being able to ensure that your business is able to continue. And as you rightly said, with that integrated into the organizational strategy and then transpiring through the operations, I think that's very important. The opportunities, I think, from an organizational point of view is around how organizations can become more efficient in their processes, in their day-to-day operations. And particularly with regards to energy use. Now, we know energy prices in South Africa are increasing significantly. So there presents opportunities to reduce energy consumption, use more renewable energy. Organizations are embracing that, setting targets to be at zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and using more renewable energy, which I think is very exciting. But on the other hand, one has to also take into account the impacts, particularly for lower income communities. Because often when we talk about climate change, we don't recognize or we don't acknowledge that the impacts that lower income communities will feel is much bigger, particularly in terms of issues like floods, droughts, and fires. And as an organization or as organizations, consumer-facing organizations, we have to be mindful of that. And we have to, in some way or the other, support the resilience and adaptive capacity of those communities. And I think that's a very important point. And then coming back to the discussion on ESG, and I think I guess we can all agree it's quite exciting to be in the field of ESG now because there's so much of interest, so much of focus, not just from investors and analysts, but also from other stakeholders like community members, NGOs, employees even. And it's exciting to be a sustainability professional in this space. But I echo the sentiments earlier around complexity, because there's quite a myriad of indices, of frameworks, and one has to navigate as an organization, one has to navigate carefully through all of that so that you're reporting against frameworks that make sense and frameworks that are directly related to your strategy and the purpose of the organization. And I think that's an important part. Yeah, and I'll leave it there, Kolisa.
Okay, no, thanks a lot, Sanjeev. I've got a climate bias, so we could talk for quite a long time on this topic. And I just want to lash on one of the things that you mentioned, like there's a surge of commitment by various organizations, whether you are in the primary energy sector or services, of net zero, achieving net zero. And I think there's a lot of will from captains of industry. And some of the questions may be, how do we get there? Especially looking at the complexity of a business environment in the current world. So thank you for those insights. And I promise you I'll make sure that I sneak in some more climate specific discussions as we go along with this discussion. Now, for our last panelist, external panelist, it's Chantal van der Walt. And Chantal, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And it's been such a pleasure listening to the various viewpoints so far. And so quite glad to be able to just offer some of my insights, having worked with quite a range of different types of organizations across a variety of sectors, from financial services, energy, mining, a little bit of retail, but I think we're quite well reflected here in that space. And then, of course, thinking across things like real estate and telecoms and that kind of thing. So hopefully can give you a feel for some of the common or important views that cross-cut through the various places that I've worked, as well as a lot of my own personal viewpoints splattered in between. So I think my starting point would be that integrating ES and G matters into the core business strategy really has become a business imperative. So the way I look at sustainability and ESG matters is that when we're dealing with that, we're actually describing that organization's ability to thrive through looking at a comprehensive and forward-looking focus on those ESG matters. So depending on the industry that we're focused on and the locations in which they need to operate, there's specific ESG factors that would be relevant for them. And they can either depend on resources, depend on inputs, be they social capital or human capital, intellectual capital, and then of course our financial capital. They can either be those inputs, or they can be and dependencies on a stable operating context, or it can literally just be, right, we sit in a context. Our business is not in a vacuum. The value that we're trying to create is for a specific end user or customer, investor. And how do we act in a way that is, as Joanne says, accountable, responsible, and drawing on those resources and using them wisely. So I think for me, the real shift when we speak about an evolving landscape has been a growing acknowledgement that these ES or G factors are not as external as they sometimes feel, that they actually really are an important part of a core business strategy, and they are often the things that allow the value creation process to really succeed. So I think when we think about some of the drivers that are relevant and that they are different per industry, top of mind things for me are looking at things like disruption and vulnerability in our socioeconomic circumstances, some massive shifts in thinking, and I think it's still yet to play out in a regulatory requirement, but a lot of different thinking around what does our economy, what does our country need to look like in order to remain competitive, in order to thrive, and to sort of navigate quite complex market demand, supply and demand priorities, thinking around the environmental tipping points. I think a number have been mentioned already, and how do we manage our goods and services, if you want to see the ecological system and the connection or touching points into that system. How do we manage that in a way that allows everybody to continue to survive and thrive off of that system into the longer term? I've seen a lot of evolution in conversation with investors and the perspectives that they have. How they look at organizations now is definitely changing. And then you overlay all of the technology and academic progress, far better data on ES and G matters than we've ever had before. And how is that influencing the internal dialogue and course correction that will need to be taking place to navigate all of the complexity that we're dealing with? So I think overall, I know that investors are looking for businesses that have that convincing embedded ESG strategy. that also have a clear path to how are we going to implement that, how are we going to arrive at the goals and commitments we've set ourselves. And then that's a lot of pressure to be dealing with and navigating on top of the normal business success factors and metrics that get monitored. So I think the positive thing and maybe the opportunity here is that when you look at research like a very interesting study done at the University of Oxford, they were looking at how an increase in firm level ESG performance actually results in quite a positive effect on a country's living standards. And that was regardless of being developed or emerging in nature. And for me, that's a very exciting thing to think on. So if businesses are able to incorporate and embed their response to the relevant E, S, or G matters in a way that allows them to thrive, it also has a very positive look or outlook onto the country's economy. So for me, I think the key point is that a transition is already upon us in the sense of a lot of environmental, social, and trust or ethics tipping points, I think, have already been reached or are quite close to being reached. And that operating context opens up a lot for organizations to respond to. So it's almost a matter of future-proofing or rethinking what do we look like in 2050, and I use that date strategically, but what do we look like then? How do we operate in a world that has different constraints to what is based on us now, be they low carbon, zero water, zero waste? How do we run our business? How do we think of ourselves and the value that we could create in light of those constraints? And I've just mentioned some of the environmental ones, but there's many more from a social perspective. And already it's starting to impact on access to capital, cost of capital, ability to underwrite and insure a business, and then certainly, of course, links to brand and reputation. So for me, ESG has become a differentiator. And I think future value add for any organization is probably going to be along the lines of how well it can understand the potential effects of the specific E, S, or G drivers that face it as an organization now and then into the future. And then that continuous adjustment of the business strategy, of how that gets embedded into and transforms in the business. And then, of course, the building of trust with stakeholders, where disclosure, I guess, comes into play. And then, responding appropriately and in a timely way to all of this outside pressure and inside drive for innovation. So that's how we've been looking at it for ourselves as well. But then, of course, with the clients that we work with around that strategic reinvention, business transformation, and then sort of reimagining the reporting and the disclosure that needs to go along with it. But of course, lots of challenges presented in actually doing that ideal. And I think some of the top points that we've sort of landed on at the moment in terms of working is around strategy and the embedding, responsible investment and sustainable finance, a massive consideration and topic. How do we get bankable projects? How do we align with the funding that is available to make the shifts we need to make? How do we respond to climate change in a way that doesn't leave anybody behind? But also really the risks and opportunities from climate change are actually social and economic in nature. So it's not a green issue in essence for me anyway. And then lastly, thinking around how do we reward and remunerate the teams that are working so hard within companies to align and to reward the right behavior and get to the right outcomes. And then how do we link this to enterprise value? Because it's a really important consideration for any company in the private sector around enterprise value, return on investment, and really getting the most out of all the energy and resource being put into it. So thank you. That would be my starting thoughts.
Wow, thanks a lot, Chantal. I mean, that's quite enlightening. And there are several words that also got me excited. You know, coming from the CSIR, you're talking about enterprise value creation. You are talking about innovation, being a differentiator, etc. These are all things that we would like to traverse in further detail in the second part of this discussion. So there are 3 points that we wish to cover, and Linda may want to switch off a camera as well to assist me in probing deeper on this. And I think the way in which we can do it is to maybe offer 2 panelists to provide some wise counsel. And I think we can benefit as well as an organization to hear from you, understanding what we do as a business as to how can we contribute in focusing our research agenda such that we can be able to support industry in order to traverse some of these complexities and difficulties. And the first part, I believe it's more of a question of scoping, which is the extent to which companies look at their value chain. I think earlier on, there's been recognition of global nature of value chains. You know, when you have a tomato in South Africa, it could well be coming from Morocco for all we know, you know, and if that's one of the areas in which a company is sourcing tomatoes, then it's of interest in terms of how you analyze your business risks and opportunities to understand what sort of climate regime is projected for that area, whether it's on a climatic or seasonal timescale, because it does affect the ability to do business. So I will not pick on any specific panelist, but just seek some words of wisdom in respect of how do we see the integration along the value chain by companies in terms of products and services that they provide, as well as what are these gaps for which there is a need for further intervention. And whilst the panelists are thinking, or one of the panelists is thinking of sharing some insights of this, it's just to let you know, participants, that Lauren is also looking at questions that are coming through a chat box. So after the 2 panelists, I may invite Lauren to also share some of the questions that she believes would be of interest to the panelists. So takers on the value chain question.
Happy to maybe share some thoughts.
Oh, that would be brilliant, Feroz. Please, you have the floor.
I think alluding to earlier points that were made, it's fundamental that if we're approaching this properly with the right mindset, that we're looking at our value chain. Our impact doesn't start and stop within our borders or at the boundaries of the organization. It's fundamental to be looking at the full value chain, both upstream and downstream. And you look at it for a variety of reasons, and the impacts are social, environmental, regulatory, whatever they may be. And part of the way we try and embed responsible behavior, we feel, is through your relationships with your suppliers and your partners, and those that you do business with, and related parties, and ensure that you choose to do business with those who are aligned to your value system and operate in the manner that meets the kind of standards that you want to meet. And in so doing, expand that circle of influence and have them do the same with their partners and suppliers. In terms of doing it for fundamental core business reasons, if you're saying, well, I'm not doing it just because I think I need to be socially responsible, ultimately you alluded to something which is intricately tied into that, but gets the attention of those who sit on the business side or who look at the numbers, is How does this impact on future supply of product or services? How does it impact on your ability to access markets? What does climate change mean? So you gave an example of a tomato, and those are real questions to be asked. I mean, in the South African context, already you can see changes in growing season, impacts on certain fruits and so on, and when and where they have become available. And these are important considerations to take into account. So fundamentally, I think I'll stop by saying it is fundamental that the full value chain is taken into account when looking at this.
Okay, thanks a lot, Feroz. And I guess value chain, if we understand it as also the post-consumer responsibility, I'm sure Linda may want to share some insights there. But I have Joanne, and then after Joanne, Linda can make some reflections. Thank you. Joanne, you have the floor.
Thank you. And it's a very simple point that I want to make, Polisa, which is that to do this, to look at your entire value chain, let alone look at the details of your enterprise and identify the opportunities, it requires a very deliberate process. It requires to be driven from a senior enough level in an organization in order to be able to bring the whole of the company into it, so that you can bring in your people involved in your operations, the people involved in sales, the people involved in marketing. So I think that is the one thing, is that support from the top, and the understanding that this goes deep into the operations and the details of the way that companies operate. And I think the second thing is really something that we've discovered in the work that we've done, not only in relation to climate change, but also in relation to issues like water, energy efficiency, even youth employability, is the target setting in companies becomes a critical element in terms of being able to say, here it is, here's where we are, here's where we want to get to, here's what the gap is, and then what are we going to do to actually bridge that gap? As well as, obviously, that is then underpinned by an understanding of how this impacts strategy. So I think that those sort of very practical on the one hand, but the will to drive, in my sense, becomes absolutely central, because otherwise what you do is you have people sitting in ESD, or people sitting in sustainability, or people sitting in a transformation unit, sort of operating on their own as sort of very isolated little people on the edge of the operations of a company. And that can't happen in a comprehensive ESG approach. Thanks.
Oh, thanks a lot for that, Joanne. I see Lauren, you had your hand up. If you could just share.
No, I was just, in terms of the conversation about the value chain, I was wanting to understand, value chains and supply chains are very different, but from the value chain perspective, how much influence does a company have over changing different perspectives and ESG perspectives in their value chain? What is the abilities to be able to do that? Are you able to get your suppliers to address issues that are important to you? Or is it that if you really rely on something and they're not necessarily willing to abide by specific sustainability issues that your company is wanting to follow, do you look for another supplier? Do you look at other activities? What is the issue around just those value chain challenges?
That's a very interesting question, and I'm sure it would vary from industry to industry depending on leverage that you have. But let's hear what our panelists think in terms of I think Feroz mentioned it. It's like your relationship with suppliers, but there's also this dynamic of how much influence do you have, and how does that impact on your ability to achieve your business and strategic objectives.
Yeah, maybe if I can comment on that as well, Kolisa. I think we've seen with COVID the importance of having shorter supply chains. I think that, when trade was being restricted globally, it was important then to be able to have supply chains that you could ensure that you had products on your shelves. And for that reason, I mean, that also has certain climate imperatives or climate benefits from shortening your supply chain and sourcing more locally. And I think that apart from climate, it has certain social aspects to it as well, in terms of job creation, in terms of employment, etc., which I think is also very important. But in terms of that dynamic, particularly in retail, between the retailer, who, like we indicated, is generally consumer facing, and the supplier, it has to happen through some level of collaboration. I don't think there may be an aspect of leverage in it, but I think, with competition and competitiveness being very important, one cannot over-exercise that. But I think what this ESG focus has been showing us is that organizations are becoming more and more familiar with the requirements, with what the requirements are. Organizations are becoming more and more receptive of engaging in aspects on ESG. So in a way, whilst it's not mainstream yet, I think the appetite and the groundswell is certainly being created for organizations to engage more and more actively in these areas. Recently, we conducted a survey of our suppliers, a sustainability survey of our suppliers. And whilst a large number of them, more than 80% of them, are actively engaging in ESG aspects, whether it's measuring, monitoring, reporting on, etc., there's still quite a few that, around 15 to 20%, that have not yet started and have not yet started engaging. And granted, these are generally the smaller suppliers. But I think with the support and the engagement and the discussions around sustainability, I think this will change.
Oh, thanks a lot, Sanjeev. Linda?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I think I just want to echo on Sanjeev's point. I think that the COVID pandemic really highlighted the weaknesses in our supply chains, in our value chains, for example. And as Sanjeev said, there was very much this call in terms of shortening supply chains. Then that kind of plays in my mind is, what does that mean for South Africa in terms of trying to domesticate our supply chains, especially where we may have existing constraints and certainly resource constraints. So, with the load shedding that we've faced since 2008 and the limits that we have on our energy system, what does that mean for manufacturing and local manufacturing? For changing climates, access to water resources, what does that mean for our agricultural sector and more domestic, food production? So certainly, I think as a country, we need to, sort of revisit our imports, exports, and really, understand where our weaknesses are, where are we vulnerable as an economy, and really how do we position ourselves and respond to that? So I think those are still some of the questions that I'm playing around with in my own mind in terms of, just the disruption we've seen over the last year and a half. Thanks.
We're so sorry, your mic is off. You're on mute.
Oh, okay. Thank you for those reflections, Linda. I think we are, this is like quite an exciting discussion, because we are dealing with a subject that changes everything, and not only in the short term, but in terms of how, as a people, we do business. And I take the points, for example, that were mentioned around where capital goes. I think it was Chantal who mentioned that, and I think Rowan mentioned that as well, is that he has never been this inundated by calls from investors in terms of how they are dealing with sustainability and ESG matters. So that's obviously one of the dials that can be looked at in terms of how to support such a transformation. And there were points that were raised as well. I think Joanne was mentioning this issue of high-level buy-in, because in my view, it's strongly related to the the peripheral nature in which the sustainability units currently operate within businesses. I mean, this is a generalization, of course. So I guess the next question that we may want to tackle, at least having these two gems so far, amongst others, it's only those I can recall for now, would be how do we ensure, or how do we support the integration of these considerations in the business strategy, okay? Where it's not a question of how one reports, you know, it becomes a question of how one does business. Do the operations people understand the touch points between sustainability and ESG in terms of their functions, whether it's buyers, it's people in the marketing department, it's people in the manufacturing plants, you know. So how do we ensure, building on, of course, there's a financial rationale, which is this is where investors are putting money. There's also a leadership rationale, which is about how these are championed. But how do we achieve, or how do we get this integration such that this is not a standalone function? Any takers on that? I see your hand, Joanne. I don't know whether it's an old hand or you'd like to share some insights on this as well.
Yeah, thanks. It was an old hand, but on this issue, I really do think that, firstly, I want to reiterate the point that it goes back to leadership will. But I think that there is, I mean, there's been a vast change in the last couple of years around the understanding within business about why sustainability is important and what the risks and threats are if we don't run our companies in sustainable ways. And really, I think that has then opened the way for an ability to be able to engage in companies, to put sustainability at the core of business strategy. And I think we've seen it in the retail sector. We've seen it in certain elements of the agro-processing sector. I think the banking sector, particularly through pressure in relation to what they lend and how they lend, has moved quite far in relation to sustainability. And I think that with the understanding that climate targets are going to have to be met internationally, and that we are moving towards a net zero 2050, in particularly the emissions intensive industry, there is suddenly a huge flurry of both R&D and investment in lower carbon intensive technologies. And I think all of those things really add up to the kind of the embedding of sustainability issues, and an understanding that we want to protect our futures and the futures of our children and of the planet is part of business in a very core way. And what I'm certainly seeing in South Africa and amongst our company members is that CEOs are talking much more assertively and much more vocally and publicly around these sustainability issues than has ever happened before. So I think that we are on a reasonably good track at the moment, but I think the kind of the ability to embed those in company systems and operations and strategies is something that is going to need to be formalized. You know, we're quite hard on ourselves as a country, as South Africans, but actually, if you look at where we sit compared to our international competitors on this issue, I would argue that we've built over a long period of time a very solid base from which to move this forward. Thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot for those inputs, Joanne. I see Rowan and then Chantal.
Thanks very much. Yes, I have to agree with Joanne on that. From my perspective, leadership is immensely important for putting a company on the track towards sustainability and towards improved ESG measures. But it's also about a relationship between good leadership and the internal capacity to implement those programs. With the leadership alone, that'll allow a company to make commitments and to set targets and to sign up to initiatives. But to really follow through on those, you do need the internal capacity to continue that work and to work with the internal teams. And remember, these things are more than just a commitment. It's about the day-to-day operations of the company. And when you're working with a commercial team or a technical team, you can't run to leadership every time something doesn't work out, or when there's a complexity or something difficult to understand. That's really up to the internal teams to be able to guide the company and to work with all the stakeholders, the internal stakeholders involved, to ensure that we are on track towards meeting those commitments. So for me, it's about the relationship between leadership and internal capacity. But also, in my view, I think there's been a big shift in South Africa, at least, in the way companies think about ESG. I've been in this space maybe for about 9 years now, and I don't think it's really comparable to where it was when I started. I think there's a lot of companies taking this very seriously, and there's a lot of work being done to move towards improved sustainability. But it's obviously, there's a lot to do. Just being on the road doesn't mean that you're close to achieving the commitment. But I have seen a lot of positive developments, and I think as long as more companies make those moves, and as long as all industries start to shift in that direction, I think we will see some positive developments in the future.
Well, thanks for that, Ron. That's certainly, the last two interventions are quite encouraging. I think our media could take a leaf on this, because as Joanne was saying, we are always hard on ourselves. But it's encouraging to hear that it's more of operationalization issues that we are starting to deal with. Otherwise, the intent is there and the effort is being put. It's about how do we scale up on those initial interventions. Chantal?
Thank you. I think just to add one thought to the rich insights already there. For me, what's been helpful is trying to put and translate these issues into the language that is helpful and insightful inside the organization. So not to say that you can put a rand value on everything and that would be the precise value, but starting to speak about value at risk, value in the opportunity, maybe the cost of not acting, and putting it into the language of the business, be it from a rands and cents. How does this start to affect or potentially affect your financial statements, and the line items in those financial statements makes very influential people in the organization start to click to the right connections and allow some good decision making to happen. So I think that's just a layer about the language we use and how we actually speak to teams that are having to make quite hard trade-offs and allow them better insights to do that. And then lastly, what I would say is similar to the way risk sort of plays out within an organization. Everyone actually has to be an ESG champion. In whatever they're doing, they've got to understand their connection to one of the material E, S, or G matters and how they are contributing, so that as a whole it all comes together effectively. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Chantal. I can identify with this point that we are raising about speaking the language that the business understands. You know, in my past life, I led the climate modeling research group at the CSIR, and they would present these highly complex analytics, you know, of what will be happening where. So I'm not a climate modeler, so my question will be nice pictures, so what? All right. And I think the point that you raise in saying we should be looking at how we start elevating these various complex considerations into a language that business understands, and I find that to be quite a very helpful point. Sanjeev, do you have your hand up, or is it an old one?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think with many organizations, it starts at when organizations are defining the materiality. Because as you indicated, it's about language, and that's the sort of language that boardrooms, executives in boardrooms are discussing. And I think when you look at industries, whether it's food, whether it's mining, whether it's banking, the issues and aspects of around ESG are there. So certainly they feature in materiality. And I think that helps then to support what Joanna was saying in terms of integrating these aspects or embedding them into the core of the organization. Because when it starts at that level, then you have a better chance of integrating and implementing through the organization. The second point I want to make is that, I mean, because it's topical, there's a lot of commitments, there's a lot of discussion and conversation around it. But one has to be careful, or rather, the flag to raise is that organizations have to be seen to be genuine and authentic when they're making commitments in terms of how they're going to implement it as well. Because, like with so many things, people are quick to jump onto the bandwagon, so to speak, and then their genuineness starts to fade. And I think when dealing with complex and dire issues like climate change and the pandemic and inequality, that genuineness from CEOs, from people within the organizations has to come through.
Oh, okay. That's materiality. I think it's actually part of the King 4 code, you know, in terms of how you understand the extent and coverage of your stakeholders. And a light bulb moment from my side is the previous discussion that we had was talking about how far do you go in the value chain. I think this could well be one of the ways of positioning it, you know, the concept of materiality in terms of the business operation itself could be one of those things that assist in understanding the scope that one defines. Lauren, I see you've got your hand up.
I just wanted to say that, you know, we are seeing more and more businesses embracing ESG and taking the commitments. But ultimately, how are we going to see that and see if actually the commitments are making a difference would be, you know, how these changes that have been made actually are reflecting in our country's contributions or performance to the SDGs. So, and our global stats, because global stats are continually reminding us that we are making huge impacts on the environment, even though sustainability has been practices in companies for decades now. There doesn't seem to be much change in the stats. So we really need to see that, you know, even though companies are making those commitments and are reporting on their reductions on the environment, etc., we really need to see that those are transferring or transpiring to our country's commitments and performance in the the SDG space.
Yeah, that's the credibility issue that Sanjeev was also talking about, which is quite important. There's one area that I intended for us to just go through it as well, which is understanding the various reporting standards and frameworks that exist. I think it has been mentioned earlier that it's a science in itself to choose which one works well or is appropriate for you. One or two reflections will be great before we request Linda to just tease out some of those exciting themes and suggestions that have been put forward. And we give each panelist a minute or so for wrap-up comments. So let's talk reporting. Yes, Feroz, you have the floor.
Thanks, Chris. I think this is something that it's an important topic and we need to talk about it because it's been alluded to before by I think Rowan spoke about it. And it is so important to balance the need for reporting versus the need for doing. And increasingly, as has been said already, with the focus on ESG, there are so many requirements or obligations that are placed on organizations that you potentially get distracted from the actual ability to work on strategy or engage with the business on actual delivery on substantive work because of the reporting. In some cases, you can call it burden. Now, obviously balancing that out, that reporting is important. I mean, you want to be able to report so you can understand, you get context, you're able to articulate your position, but also reporting gives you a view of what you're doing in a way that you wouldn't normally get if you weren't collecting this data. You know, reporting can be used as a tool to improve systems internally for data capture, for management. You can draw a lot of insights and intelligence out of it, depending on how you manage your data. So certainly there's good value in reporting. But I think what we must be very careful of is a tendency to over-report or a requirement for over-reporting. And that's something that I think over the years you just see the increase of them. And reporting is both. You get reporting where you drive reporting and you want to follow frameworks, or there's those kind of things. But there's also, beyond just reporting as a proactive, as an active tool, there's associated with that a lot of indices, a lot of external organizations, rating companies and industries which require input, which you might not even be proactively seeking to participate in, but because of their profile, of their nature, have external relevance. People place score on it, and you then need to participate in reviewing those and so on. And you get to a point where you ultimately have teams who sit and their job is to report, and you need to consider, well, is that the best use of resources? And so I think my point is there needs to be a important balance between the need for reporting versus the need for doing, and we need to ensure which one are we, what are we aiming for primarily.
Nice one there, Feroz. Very clear points. And Ron?
Yeah, just to agree with Feroz, it's a difficult topic because reporting is fundamentally important. So from an external perspective, one would have to be able to compare different companies using a similar methodology. And often companies follow a whole host of different ways of reporting, which if for example, CSIR wants to do a study on retailers, it makes it difficult for them if every retailer will report things in different ways, because then you don't know if you're comparing apples with apples. So reporting is very important, but just to also emphasize, as Feroz said, that there needs to be the right balance between the reporting requirements and actually doing the work, because the work is already complex on its own, and it requires a lot of internal engagement. But with all the pressures that comes with external reporting, it sometimes becomes difficult to have enough time to do that internal work as well. But then another thing to raise is perhaps the fact that a lot of the ESG reporting requirements don't necessarily look at the data that's already been made publicly available by the company. So as an example, we all do our sustainability reports and we report through CDP and all those different mechanisms. But many of the ESG agencies, when they approach the company, they don't do that after they've already reviewed all the information that's already publicly available, which sometimes, and that's not true for everybody. There's a lot of organizations that do review the information that's available. But sometimes that's where the difficulty lies, is it's not that the company just needs to report the information, it's that they have to re-report the information that they already reported publicly. But yes, just to agree with Feroz, it's about getting the right balance between the two.
Okay, thanks a lot for that reiteration there, Rowan. And having touched a bit on reporting, and I think there are some really big bones to chew on when it comes to the points that have been presented. I just want to give Linda about 3 to 5 minutes, give an opportunity to just, from her point of view, what is she gleaning out of the discussions that we've had in the last hour? Linda, you. You have the floor.
Thanks very much, Professor. Yeah, I think the key messages that really have come out for me listening to our colleagues across the different businesses that we have with us today. The first one is the issue around change. I think almost consistently across the panel, this issue around change, the changing landscape, the fact that we're seeing change at an unprecedented rate. And this is creating risk, business risk, it's creating risk to the economy, societal risk, environmental risk, it's creating vulnerability. The question is then, how do we respond to that? How do we produce resilient businesses? How do we produce a resilient South African economy? And there, a number of the speakers spoke about being accountable to stakeholders, being accountable to the public, how, developing a level of agility in terms of responding to that, and really importantly, integrating this response, this end goal of where we want to get to as a business, of where we want to get to as a country, integrating that to the heart of the strategy. This is no more about marketing, it's no more around greenwashing. If we don't make these changes, it has very real impacts on business and on the South African economy. And I think certainly we're already feeling that. We're feeling the impact of our energy constraints on the South African economy. We're seeing the water constraints, etc. What happens when we start to see the resource constraints on our economy? So I think then, with that end goal in mind, how do we innovate? How do we build new kinds of businesses? Because absolutely, there are big constraints facing us as we move forward. But as all of the speakers mentioned, there is opportunity in that. It's rethinking our business models. It's rethinking how we get goods and services to consumers. Can we do that in a less resource-intensive way? Can we do it, for example, as product as service, rather than, for example, the traditional business models of trying to sell stuff? I think, we absolutely have to look at this issue of consumption. I think, unfortunately, just so many of our business models are based on consumption. And at the heart of that is what is driving all of our big environmental issues. The Global Resources Outlook speaks about the fact that 50% of our climate impacts, 90% of our water stress, 90% of our biodiversity loss comes from resource extraction and processing. And we're doing that to make and sell more stuff. So I think in response to that, the question then becomes, acceptance. How do we accept this change into our business models, into our policy landscape? Very often when we sit in environments like this, I feel like we're talking to the converted. We're all talking the same language, but we really do need to now filter that out into the broader mindset within business, within the public. The second issue is around scale. There is so much great stuff already happening across businesses, but we haven't achieved the scale yet that we actually need for impact and change. How do we develop the level of agility to test ideas, to pilot ideas, to make changes, and then to fast track the implementation of those pilot projects to achieve scale? The third issue is around time. Given the changing landscape, we don't have the luxury of time anymore. We need to be making these changes now if we want to achieve the commitments that we've made and to address these big global threats in terms of climate, in terms of resource availability. So I think those were really the main issues for me. But I think that while there are absolutely constraints and challenges, there are certainly opportunities. And I forget who mentioned it, but I think it is those businesses that recognize the opportunity, who are agile and who change the way that they do things to accommodate that end goal in mind, that vision of where we want to get to. How do we feed 9 billion people? How do we achieve the SDGs, etc.? It's those businesses that will thrive. And we're seeing incredible businesses emerge in the local and international landscape with completely new, different business models. Young entrepreneurs who are embracing so many of these ideas around the circular economy. So I think absolutely an incredibly exciting time to be in. Thanks.
I'm not sure where Kalisa has got to. He seems to have disappeared. Oh.
In the absence of our moderator then, perhaps I need to stand in as host for the last few seconds. I think we have reached the end of our time. So in Kolisa's absence, let me just do a very big thank you to all of our panelists that have joined us this afternoon. I think it's been an incredibly rich session, and I know certainly from my side, I could talk about this all day and to hear the great comments and the great experience across our different businesses. So thank you very much to all of our panelists and for our hosts as well in terms of being able to participate in this event. Kolisa has joined us. Sorry. Lisa, I was just thanking our panelists in your absence, but I'll give you the closing words. Thank you.
No, I'm really happy with the time our panelists have spent to explore this discussion, as well as the insights, that have been shared. I guess Linda was saying we tend to speak to the converted, and we all believe, as this panel, that one of the biggest heritage we can bestow on our kids is actually the very same earth, that we live in. And we will be engaging with you continuously, on this subject to understand. This is more selfish from the CSIR side as well, to understand how should we be directing our research, our innovation, development of systems and tools for different sectors, etc., in order to support this transition towards more sustainable business. Having mentioned the word heritage, again, I would like to thank you all and wish you a very pleasant Heritage Day tomorrow, and you enjoy the long weekend. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to participate.
Thank you.
Always good insights from you, John.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye,
Thank you.
everybody. Thank
Thanks
you.
very much.
Wow.
Bye.
Yeah.
Apologies there, my microphone was off, so you couldn't hear me. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the Sustainability Summit for 2021. It has been great, it's been complex, we've contradicted ourselves on so many levels, but still super happy that we got to the crux of the matter without fear of judgment, without fear of being biased to a certain degree, and also tackling the facts and holding certain agencies accountable. So thank you very much. The summit would not be possible without your participation as the delegate. We hope to meet same time, same place next year. Please continue to post your last or final thoughts and comments. Even recommendations are more than welcome on SAS Week 21 on all our social media platforms. And if you want to send videos, hey, please do. Thank you very much for all of you who visited our virtual exhibition. And the prizes are still there. Winners will be announced in the week. So we just need to adjudicate and check who visited, how frequently, and so forth. So Cape Media will be in touch with you in that regard. And last but not least, let us thank our sponsors who made this event and the summit possible, particularly Syngenta, Sunrail, CSIR, PPC Africa, Vinolia, and all the others. We advertised you behind my head. My poor blonde hair was just flustered with all these logos. So even if I don't mention all of you, just know that we still are honored. Please do so next year. Mazweli, we are coming after you with all these projects. So to join us. And once again, let me say the sky is not the limit. It is only the starting point. Do take care. Thank you.